There's something quietly unsettling about how loud the world has become. Not loud in sound, but loud in presence. Everything asks to be seen. Everything wants proof. Moments don't feel complete unless they're captured, shared, reacted to. And in the middle of all this exposure, there's a strange kind of person who does the opposite. They don't announce themselves. They don't document their life. They don't disappear completely, but they exist on the edges, watching, listening, staying silent. Most people misunderstand them immediately. They say things like, "They're shy," or "They don't have much going on," or worse, "They're hiding." But silence, especially in a world built on noise, is rarely accidental. It's often intentional, and intention always has psychology behind it. We've been taught to believe that expression equals existence. If you don't post, you're not really there. If you don't update, you're forgotten. If you don't show yourself, you don't matter. But that belief is not natural. It's learned, conditioned, reinforced by systems designed to reward visibility and punish absence. Over time, this creates a subtle fear, the fear of being unseen. And yet, some people step directly into that fear and stay there, calmly, consistently. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Not everyone wants to be perceived, and that doesn't mean they lack confidence. Often it means the opposite. Because when you stop curating how others see you, you're forced to sit with who you actually are. No captions to soften it, no filters to frame it, just you, uninterrupted. Psychologically, silence can function as a boundary, a line drawn between the inner self and the external world. For people who don't post, that boundary protects something fragile but essential: identity before performance. They understand, sometimes intuitively, that once a moment is shared, it no longer belongs only to them. It becomes public property, open to interpretation, to misunderstanding, to judgment. And judgment changes how we remember things. It changes how we feel about our own experiences. Studies in cognitive psychology show that external feedback reshapes internal memory. When others react to your moment, their reaction becomes part of how you store it. That means the moment is no longer pure. It's altered, reframed, edited by perception. So some people choose to keep their experiences unedited. They don't want the world's fingerprints on their memories. They want to feel things fully, privately, without the invisible pressure to turn life into something consumable. This isn't antisocial behavior, it's selective engagement. But there's another layer beneath that choice, a deeper one. Social media doesn't just encourage sharing, it quietly trains comparison. Every post exists next to someone else's highlight, someone else's success, someone else's happiness. And even when you know those images are curated, your nervous system still reacts. Comparison is automatic. Emotional reactions happen before rational ones. People who don't post often understand this cost. They notice how quickly self-worth can become externally referenced, how identity starts bending toward what performs well instead of what feels true. So they step back. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to breathe again. Silence for them becomes a way to regain agency, a way to say, I don't need to explain my existence to be real. And in a culture obsessed with visibility, that's a quiet form of resistance. But silence is not emptiness, it's filled with observation. People who stay quiet online often see more than those who speak constantly. They notice patterns, emotional shifts, subtle inconsistencies. They listen without preparing a response. They absorb without needing to react. This creates a different relationship with the world, one that's slower, heavier, more deliberate. And it's often mistaken for distance when, in reality, it's depth. The paradox is this: the less you broadcast, the more you feel. The more you sit with experiences instead of packaging them, the more they imprint on you. You're not distracted by how something will be perceived. You're present for how it actually feels. And presence in this age is rare. That's why the psychology of those who don't post isn't about absence. It's about containment, about choosing where energy goes, about protecting the inner world from becoming content. Because once everything becomes content, nothing feels sacred anymore. There's a moment most people never notice. It happens right before they post something meaningful. A pause, a subtle internal check. How will this be received? That pause is where psychology lives. And for people who stop posting, that pause becomes a stopping point, not a bridge. Because once you become aware of that question, it changes everything. You realize you're no longer acting purely from experience. You're acting from anticipation. Anticipation of reaction, of validation, of silence. And silence, when expected online, hurts differently than silence in real life. Psychologists call this self-presentational pressure. It's the constant awareness of being evaluated, even when nobody is actively watching. Your mind learns to simulate an audience. You imagine responses before they exist. You edit yourself before anyone else has a chance to. Over time, that creates emotional fatigue. Not the loud kind, the quiet, draining kind. For some people, this pressure becomes unbearable, not because they're weak, but because they're perceptive. They notice how every post slightly pulls them away from themselves, how they begin to narrate their own life instead of living it, how moments lose weight once they're turned into updates. And here's something rarely said out loud. Posting isn't neutral. It trains your brain to associate meaning with response. Dopamine doesn't care if the attention is positive or negative. It only cares that it's there. Likes, comments, views, even being ignored, all reinforce the same loop. Your value is being measured. People who step away from posting often do so after realizing this loop has started shaping their emotions. They notice mood swings tied to engagement, confidence rising and falling based on reactions, a subtle dependence forming. So they withdraw, not in protest, in protection. This is where emotional independence comes in. Research consistently shows that individuals with a strong internal locus of control tend to seek less external validation. Their sense of worth comes from internal coherence, not social approval. They don't need their feelings echoed back to believe they exist. But emotional independence comes with a cost. It can look like detachment. Others may interpret silence as disinterest. Friends might assume distance. The world isn't good at reading quiet people, especially online, where absence is often mistaken for emptiness. Yet internally, these individuals are anything but empty. Their inner dialogue is active, reflective, sometimes overwhelming. They process experiences deeply because they're not offloading them immediately. They sit with emotions longer. They let thoughts mature instead of publishing them mid-formation. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. When you don't post, you remove yourself from constant comparison. You stop measuring your life against timelines that aren't yours. You stop wondering if you're behind. And slowly, without noticing, your nervous system calms. Time feels different, slower, less fragmented. Moments stretch instead of breaking into pieces meant for sharing. You start doing things without narrating them, cooking without photographing it, walking without tracking it, feeling without explaining it. This reintroduces a lost psychological state, intrinsic motivation. You act because the action itself is meaningful, not because it produces a response. And intrinsic motivation is closely linked to long-term well-being. People who live this way report higher emotional stability, even if their lives look quieter from the outside. But quiet doesn't mean safe. Silence also exposes you to yourself. Without the buffer of constant expression, unresolved thoughts surface. Old emotions rise. Questions you avoided start asking themselves. This is why not everyone can tolerate silence. It requires emotional literacy. Some people post because they're empty. Others post because they're overflowing. But many stop posting because they're finally listening. And listening changes you. You become more selective about people, about experiences, about what deserves your energy. You realize that connection doesn't need witnesses, that intimacy doesn't need proof, that meaning doesn't need to be seen to be real. So when someone stays quiet online, it's rarely because they have nothing to say. Often, it's because they've realized something most haven't yet. Not everything meaningful needs to be shared. Some things grow better in the dark. Silence doesn't just remove noise, it removes distraction. And once distraction is gone, you're left alone with the raw material of your inner world. That's where many people panic, because they discover that without constant stimulation, validation, or projection, they don't actually know who they are yet. This is why constant posting feels safer than silence. It gives structure, feedback, a sense of orientation. When you're visible, you're anchored by reaction. When you're invisible, you're anchored only by yourself. And that requires something many people were never taught: identity security. Identity security is the ability to feel stable without being mirrored, to know who you are without confirmation, to remain grounded even when no one is responding. It's not confidence in the loud sense, it's not charisma, it's internal alignment, and it's rare. People who stop posting often do so at the exact moment they realize their sense of self has become too dependent on being perceived. They notice that their emotions are no longer private, that every feeling is subtly shaped by how shareable it is. Even sadness becomes curated. Even joy becomes strategic. At some point, this creates a fracture, a psychological split between the lived self and the displayed self. And living inside that split is exhausting. You're constantly managing an image instead of inhabiting a body. You're thinking about perception instead of sensation. Silence heals that fracture. Slowly, unevenly, but genuinely. When someone withdraws from posting, they begin rebuilding their identity from the inside out. Instead of asking, "How does this look?" they ask, "How does this feel?" Instead of performing growth, they experience it. And growth, real growth, is not photogenic. It's confusing. It's non-linear. It's often boring. This is where a lot of misunderstandings come from. Outsiders assume quiet people are stagnant, that if nothing is visible, nothing is happening. But psychology tells us the opposite. The deepest transformations often occur without witnesses, especially identity-level changes. Think about grief, or shame, or deep personal change. These processes don't unfold well under observation. They require privacy, space, time without interruption. When someone posts less, they're often in the middle of something internal that hasn't finished forming yet. There's also a protective instinct at play. Posting exposes you to interpretation. Once something is public, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to reactions, projections, misunderstandings. For people who feel deeply, that exposure can feel invasive. Not because they're fragile, but because they're sensitive to meaning. Psychologists refer to this as psychological ownership, the feeling that certain experiences are yours in a way that shouldn't be diluted. Sharing reduces that ownership. It invites commentary. It opens the door to comparison. And for some personalities, that cost is too high. So they keep their experiences intact, untouched, not hidden, but held. And here's the paradox. These people are often the most emotionally rich, the most observant, the most thoughtful. They notice patterns others miss because they're not distracted by broadcasting themselves. They listen more than they speak. They watch dynamics instead of dominating them. Online, this looks like absence. In reality, it's presence. Another factor is emotional exhaustion. Social media creates the illusion of constant connection, but it rarely delivers emotional nourishment. You see lives intersecting without touching, conversations without depth, reactions without understanding. Over time, this creates a subtle loneliness even in hyperconnectivity. Some people realize that posting more doesn't cure this loneliness. It intensifies it. Because attention without intimacy is hollow. Being seen without being known is empty. So they opt out. Not because they don't want connection, but because they want real connection. The kind that doesn't need timestamps, or proof, or algorithms. They start paying attention to who reaches out without prompts, who remembers them without reminders, who checks in without seeing an update first. And those connections feel heavier, more grounded, more human. Silence filters relationships. It reveals who values you beyond your visibility. And slowly, something shifts. They stop equating presence with relevance. They stop measuring their existence by engagement. They realize that being unseen doesn't erase them. It simply removes noise. This is where many people misinterpret quietness as loneliness. But the two are not the same. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Silence is the absence of performance. Some of the most grounded people you know are the least visible online, because their lives are happening elsewhere, in conversations that don't get recorded, in moments that don't get posted, in inner worlds that don't need approval to exist. In the digital age, silence is no longer neutral. It is interpreted as absence, disengagement, or even failure. Platforms are designed to equate activity with existence. If you are not posting, reacting, or updating, the system quietly treats you as if you are fading. Over time, many people internalize this logic without realizing it. Visibility becomes relevance, and relevance slowly turns into worth. This is where the psychological trap tightens. Once worth depends on being seen, silence starts to feel unsafe. At the center of this mechanism sits the dopamine loop. Every post, every like, every comment triggers a small neurological reward. Not joy exactly, but anticipation. The brain learns to associate attention with confirmation of value. Gradually, life begins to be experienced in terms of potential reactions rather than lived meaning. Moments are no longer evaluated by how they feel, but by how they might be received. Identity shifts subtly. Instead of asking, "Who am I becoming?" the question becomes, "How am I being perceived?" Now consider what happens when someone steps out of that loop. When experiences stop being offered to the machine, that decision is rarely impulsive. It usually follows a quiet realization that something essential has been outsourced. Attention, validation, even memory. When posting stops, the brain no longer receives constant micro-confirmations. At first, this absence can feel uncomfortable, even empty. But over time, something steadies. The sense of self stops rising and falling with feedback. Emotional regulation moves inward. From a psychological standpoint, this reflects a shift from external to internal locus of control. People who rely heavily on posting anchor their emotional state to reactions they cannot control. People who disengage begin anchoring it to internal coherence instead. This does not eliminate doubt or insecurity. It changes how those feelings are processed. They are handled privately rather than broadcast for reassurance. The emotional environment becomes quieter, less reactive, less performative, more stable. This is why online silence is so often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal or disinterest. From the inside, it often feels like consolidation. Identity becomes less fragmented because it no longer needs to be constantly translated into content. Thoughts can remain unfinished. Emotions can exist without explanation. Experiences can stay complex instead of being simplified for consumption. An important distinction emerges here between discipline and deprivation. People who stop posting are not necessarily denying themselves connection. Many are redefining it. Instead of diffuse validation from many, they seek resonance with a few. Instead of constant exposure, they choose selective presence. This is not avoidance, it is boundary setting. Of course, silence does not always come from strength. For some, it is driven by fear of judgment, fear of misinterpretation, fear of being ignored. Social platforms amplify self-presentational pressure, the feeling that everything you say must be optimized, likable, and safe. When that pressure becomes overwhelming, silence becomes a refuge. This kind of silence is protective, not peaceful, and it deserves a different kind of understanding. What ultimately matters is not whether someone posts or not, but the role visibility plays in their sense of self. When being seen becomes necessary to feel real, the system is in control. When silence can exist without anxiety, the individual is. That is the psychological difference. Identity matures in spaces where it is not constantly observed. Development requires privacy. Reflection requires slowness. Integration requires time without interruption. Social media collapses all three. Silence restores them. This is why many people who step away from posting report a subtle recalibration. Time feels slower. Attention deepens. Conversations regain texture. Without an audience, experiences become less edited and more embodied. You are no longer preparing a version of yourself for others. You are simply inhabiting yourself. And that shift, quiet and unannounced, changes everything.